Please start.
Yeah. Good evening, friends, to the 12th of the series in the state of gender equality, hashtag gender gaps, a series that's brought to you by Gender Impact Studies Center at the Impact and Policy Research Institute in collaboration with Delhi Post News, GenDev Center for Research and Innovation, and CityMakers Mission International. Today we have an eminent speaker talking about something very important. We have Dr. Lekha Chakraborty. She'll be talking about monetary fiscal policy responses to the pandemic and the state of gender inequality. Before I start, I think, just a brief introduction to Dr. Lekha. Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is a professor and chair at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She's also affiliated as research associate with the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. She's the pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India, with Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government of India in 2004. Her areas of interest are macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing, human development, and gender budgeting. She is a recipient of Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from the Indian Institute of Social Science, IISc Bangalore. She is the author of Fiscal Consolidation, Budget Deficits, and Macroeconomy, Sage Publications. This book has received endorsement and reviews from former RBI Governor, Professor Y.V. Reddy, and former IMF Executive Director, Fiscal Affairs, Professor Vito Tanzi. She's also the co-author of the book, Social Sector in Decentralized Economy, India in the Era of Globalization, Cambridge University Press, 2016. She has worked with the IMF, World Bank, the UNSCP, the UNDP, and the UN Women, and the Commonwealth Secretariat on short stints. Her work experience on macro fiscal policy and human development spans across 7 countries: Sweden, Canada, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Mexico, and more frequently in the Asia-Pacific region. She was twice an awardee of Shastri Indo-Canadian Program from Development of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Government of Canada. She was visiting professor at American University, Washington, D.C., Uppsala University, Sweden, Carleton University, Canada, and University of Utah, US, on gender, macroeconomics, and international trade courses. She received PhD in economics in 2004 from the Center for Development Studies, JNU, where she was also associate professor for 1 year, 2007-2008. She has papers in national and international journals. She's a columnist in the Financial Express and also in Business Line, Hindustan Times, and Scroll, and featured in CNBC, ANI, DD News, AIR World Service, and Rajya Sabha. Her research areas include macroeconomics of public deficits, physical monetary policy linkages, financial inclusion, microfinance, effectiveness of public expenditure, gender budgeting, human development, fiscal federalism, decentralization, and physical research on mining tax and competitiveness of extractive industries. So friends, we have someone who is going to talk about topics which many may not understand, but in fact, Dr. Lekha is also going to make us know as to what her topic will be. And we look forward to a very interesting and engaging presentation from her. Over to you, Dr. Lekha.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And it is very special when Dr. Arjun asked me to talk to you about monetary policy, fiscal policy responses to the pandemic and the state of gender equality. And thank you so much for your kind words, Dr. Indu Prakash ji. And, as Arjun pointed out, before I begin my lecture on monetary and fiscal policy, a slight clarification on these two terms. The monetary policy, what I meant is the policies taken by the central bank of our country. And the fiscal policy is basically the government related, what our North Bloc, our Ministry of Finance, the kind of policies taken by them. And if I look at the narrative of the, fiscal policy and the monetary policy reactions to the pandemic, the narrative was whatever it takes to deal with the pandemic. So that was a kind of seriousness and urgency. And Shri Shaktikant Das, our RBI governor, our RBI governor has rightly pointed out that we need to respond to the pandemic with whatever it takes to. And over the past few months, we hope that we have systematically flattened the curve by containing this pandemic. But we came to know that there are second wave and third wave, and we need to constantly address this health concern. And equally, we need to create and sustain the policies which help us to have a quick recovery, whether it is U-shaped or V-shaped. And evidences are also there which is alarming that the situation, it's like a dual crisis. The situation is worsening, and as a public health crisis and as a macroeconomic crisis, we need to have policies like never before and react to this pandemic. And of course, if you look at the international agencies, how they project the global growth, then you can see that to the extent of -3%, there is a shrinkage in the global growth. And they have revised it in such a short time, many times. And due to the great lockdown in many countries, it was worsened than the Great Depression or the global financial crisis. The cumulative loss to the global GDP over 2020 and 2021 due to this pandemic was around more than $9 trillion. So such is the seriousness of this crisis. And let us see how central banks responded to this crisis, because it's an uncharted territory of central banks, because the framework before us, it was how to deal with the life versus livelihood framework. And the central banks came with economic policies which are of twofold. One was an instantaneous economic firefighting, like how to ensure the liquidity infusion into the system to stabilize the market reactions. And the second was the long-term policy imperatives that, the crisis was of unprecedented scale, and, it requires quick, urgent policy responses. So, many countries, like in United States, Federal Reserve, their central bank, they lowered the interest rates effectively to zero. They engage in unlimited asset purchases. They established emergency lending facilities to keep the credit flowing to the households and businesses. So, in a flexible inflation targeting framework, they did whatever they could do to deal with this pandemic. And look at the European Union, the central bank, European Central Bank, they also have, come up with emergency pandemic packages. And, it's like debt deficit dynamics of each of the countries, whether it is in the Western world or whether it is in the Asian countries, they have re-articulated the debt deficit dynamics, because this is not a moment in which we think that the deficit is something which we need to keep it at 3% of GDP as per the fiscal rules of our country. No, this is a time in which we need to spend money or identify sources of revenue to deal with the pandemic. But across countries, if you look at the way they have come up with the economic stimulus packages, the important constraint was money. For instance, in the Western world, they could float an economic pandemic package to the extent of 10% of GDP. But in the context of the developing countries, money, the fiscal space, is a serious concern. So when the fiscal space is a serious concern, the way we design the policies get shrunk, because the revenue certainty and how we design the fiscal policies, these are linked. In our country, we have floated different types of economic stimulus in such a manner that it was in continuum. It was not a major stimulus. because we thought that revenue stability should be the basis of designing the pandemic package. If revenue stability is something which is used to frame the pandemic policies, what happens is that we won't be able to just spend a hell lot of money the way we could have spent, because Indian government of India has not decided that we will go with a huge stimulus package, whether it is cash transfers to the needy people or whether it is an employer of last resort policies or financial empowerment. What government of India was doing over the time since March was, announcing as episodic what was required for the liquidity infusion. So whether it has worked well or not, we need to see in terms of the nature of announcements. So many of the announcements were short-term in nature, and those kind of reform-oriented announcements take time to get results. And some of the pandemic package announcements were economic firefighting in nature. For instance, the government has given the cash transfers to the women in the lower income households to deal with the pandemic. And the government ensured the policy for women, energy infrastructure, a gender budgeting policy of giving clean fuel to the women in the lower income households. This was a policy on board, but it was strengthened in the context of pandemic. So these were the two clear, direct policy initiatives government of India has taken for women's empowerment or gender equality. And the other kinds of gender assessments from the existing pandemic package, we need to do a derived analysis, not direct. For instance, if the liquidity infusion by central bank is towards the small and medium term enterprises, as most of the women are working in the small and medium term enterprises, it really helped them. Look at other country context in the Asia Pacific region. Right now, I'm working on a major project with UN Women on gender assessments of the economic pandemic package. As a part of that study, when we looked into the country context of Asia Pacific, we came to know that in many countries, even the interest rate was waived for women, when they are entrepreneurs. And in some country context, we came to know that it's not the cost of credit that matters, but access to credit is what matters for women. But if you take any country, for instance, the dual work burden of women is quite huge in the times of pandemic. And studies have already come up with the results that the pandemic times, the domestic violence against women is getting accelerated. So the mental health is a cause of concern. And these are the important issues. One, care economy work along with the work from home. Second, the domestic violence, it's getting increased. Third, the kind of cash transfers required, the liquid money required for women to have access to the minimum essential services. And four, the kind of support she needed for employment. So when government floated the pandemic package, Government of India has given adequate emphasis on the government acting as an employer of last resort. When everything else failed, the government coming up with a policy that we strengthen the employment opportunities by guaranteeing the job. That is, you participate in the economic activity and earn an income. And this is quite contrast to the idea of cash transfers. The cash transfer is a basic income. You don't have to work or you don't have to participate in the economic activity to earn an income. So we can have a debate that in the era of, we are in the extraordinary times and we need to respond to it, with extraordinary policies. That response has to be also extraordinary. So whether participation income is better or basic income is better is one question we need to highlight. And over the months, Government of India has taken a conscious decision that we will go ahead with the participation income, but not the basic income by designing a huge cash transfers. But empirically, we need to see whether it is it is enabling a demand stimulus in the economy, and it helps us to have an economic revival. Another important point is when you design a pandemic package, economics pandemic package for any country for that matter, what is the framework, the analytical framework of your thought process? Are you thinking about reviving the economic growth, or are you thinking about the humanitarian concerns? Ideally, it has to be both. But in many countries, economic pandemic package was floated from the paradigm of economic growth. But this is a moment in which we need to take the economic policy ahead from the economic growth perspectives to economic growth plus. By what I mean economic growth plus, that's nothing but human concerns. The policies related to capability deprivation, whether it is migration crisis, whether it is plummeting labor crisis, whether it is increasing the minimum wages for the people, whether it is creating employment, all these concerns are very important, along with the policies we design for economic revival. And let's have a quick check at the state of economy, whether it is reviving or not. We get the high frequency data, the inferences from the high frequency data, based on many indicators. In October, we got the signs, or we got some clues that the economy is, going towards a revival. But whether this revival is sustained, what are the policy packages we require to support this revival and to make it sustained? This is an important question we need to, address. And if you look at the indicators, of course, we have the industrial revival. But in terms of the credit deployment, if you look at, why there is no takers for credit in the economy, why there is no demand revival. And if you look at the RBI policies, the central bank, the Monetary Policy Committee, they have come up with the announcement that they reduce the repo rate. And the recent reconstituted Monetary Policy Committee, they kept the repo rate at 4%. And what is repo rate? It's a rate at which the central bank lends to the commercial banks. But unless there is a monetary policy transmission mechanism, this rate reduction will not reach the ultimate, the customers, or it will not stimulate the economy unless the commercial banks also take suitable steps in to reduce the interest rate. So a reverse repo rate. What is reverse repo rate? The rate in which commercial banks park their money in central banks. So RBI basically nudge the central banks, the commercial banks to lend. But we have data, we have estimates, we showed that in spite of this nudging process, there was a kind of parking of funds with RBI with the reverse repo rate. So that's a concern. This is a time in which we need to lend money, but there may not be adequate demand for the economy to get this, we may not get the credit takers. So that's really a concern. And we have not reached a liquidity trap like other developed countries. What is liquidity trap? When the central bank reduces their interest rate, if it is reaching a zero bound, then monetary policy or the central bank policy acting as a counter-cyclical public policy tool may cease to function. At that point of time, it is the fiscal policy and the public finance and what Ministry of Finance are doing that is going to be creating a adequate impact to have the stimulus or to have the economic revival. So this is a concern. When monetary policy is ineffective, then what can fiscal policy do? That fiscal policy dominance, that's what is happening. And another important debate I want to flag here is we need to find money. We need to find money for the economic pandemic package, for economic firefighting, and for the long-term, reform process. But how do you find money? If we are, if we are floating our pandemic package, based on the revenue stability. The pandemic times, that's a period in which there are a lot of revenue uncertainties to how to tackle this. So we need to think innovative sources of financing the deficit. So basically, in a country, deficit, that can be financed through three major sources. One is you print money and finance your deficit. That is, central bank is supporting the fiscal policy programs, money financing of fiscal programs. We also call it as seigniorage financing. And second is what India do predominantly is bond financing. And third is we go to the external financing, external sources, and finance our deficit. And each of these modes of financing the deficit has got its own macroeconomic policy consequences. For instance, if we are financing our deficit through money, through printing money, it can have inflationary consequences, inflation. And if you're doing bond financing beyond a limit, that can lead to a rise in interest rates, that can lead to crowding out, whether direct or financial crowding out. And if you're using the external financing of deficit, that can lead to many balance of payment problems, because our foreign exchange reserve, we need to be very careful whether the major chunk of our foreign exchange reserve is hot money or portfolio money. If it is hot money always reflects to the high interest rates. So if US Central Bank, Fed increases the interest rates, the money can be flighty, the capital can be flighty if they have an attractive interest rate. So there are many issues related. And if you're going for multilateral agencies, financing your deficit, that can have conditionality, or many financial oligarchy deciding on the economic decisions of our own country. So many things are related to, going for external financing. So I am not taking a stance that what our country should be doing in terms of financing the deficit, but I flag this because there is a re-emergence of thought process to go back to monetized deficit, money financing for certain fiscal programs. And also there is a re-emergence of thought process that public debt is, of course, it is not good, but it is not so bad in the times of pandemic. Because in the times of pandemic, if we decide that, okay, we won't do anything to alter the public debt GDP ratio, which is supposed to be 60% in our country, we cannot do anything. If we have that strict public debt GDP threshold in our mind, it can constrain expenditure. So the fiscal rules are very important, but path to attain the fiscal consolidation is equally important. Suppose if we are using tax buoyancy, that's a very good way, but expenditure compression, downsizing the government to reach to that point of fiscal consolidation, then it can affect the capital infrastructure formation in our country. It can affect human capital formation in our country. And in times of pandemic, it can roll into a humanitarian crisis. So let's wait and see what is the next stimulus package announcement from the government of India. And two things I would like to highlight here. One is, I hope that there will be more announcements related to tackling the public health infrastructure crisis to deal with the pandemic. And second is the education. Our enrollment, the effective enrollment rate is declining, and in the times of pandemic, unless the children have access to internet and access to the systems, the literacy rate and the enrollment is getting worsened, and we are taking our country back to pre-80 levels in terms of educational attainment. So this digital divide, the access of children to proper infrastructure, digital infrastructure for education. So I think this, we need to have an economic firefighting package for people to get access to education. So this is one of the major concerns, and I hope this will be given adequate emphasis in our next pandemic package announcement. So far, what we have dealt with is, of course, it has led to a high frequency data shows that it led to an economic revival. That's what the October data shows, our high frequency data shows. But what we have not attained from the data on board is the lack of jobs. The jobs are plummeting. Income is coming down. So what could be that pandemic package announcement to sustain the jobs? Because otherwise there is economic revival, but there is a lag in the growth. And in the times of pandemic, the jobs are coming down. This we need to highlight. And from the gender perspective, recently, Center for Statistical Organization has come up with an important survey that is a time use survey. And from the time use survey, we have got the inferences from the time use survey earlier in 1999, 2000. Based on that, we understood how much stressed is the unpaid care economy in our country. And the recent figures, that was just for the 5 states in India in 2000. But in 2020, we got the time use survey, the chronology of the time used by men and women, in as per the systems of national accounts, only the GDP calculation, only that kind of economic activity is only given weightage. But in the time survey, the importance of going beyond or extending the production boundary of the systems of national accounts and to give a statistical visibility for the care economy is very crucial. And, there a gender lens is also quite crucial. And I stop here by highlighting, the unpaid care economy, by the importance of, giving emphasis to the digital divide and how it is affecting children, especially girl children, and also the importance of having, because our public health GDP ratio is around 1%. So we have to, have a pandemic package which focuses on the health crisis concern, because here we economists cannot take an important decision regarding the crisis, because it is not like Great Depression that has happened in 1930. It's not like the global financial crisis that has happened in 2006-7. It is a crisis which is predominantly a public health crisis. So we need to take constant inputs from the public health experts, because we economists cannot take a policy decision in isolation. So that's the importance, like it's a dual crisis, a public health crisis and a macroeconomic crisis. So from this backdrop, we need to address the gender concerns. And I stop here and look forward to interacting with you. Thank you.
Indu, sir? Okay. No. Yeah, I'm saying, yeah. Thanks a lot, Professor Lekha, for a very illuminating presentation. And I must say that you have touched upon an issue which is very crucial and many people don't understand. And in terms of, the monetary and fiscal policy you mentioned as to what the government of India has done and what various countries in the world has been doing. And, both in terms of intervening, in the life and livelihoods as such. You mentioned about debt deficit dynamics, in fact, during the pandemic. You have also, mentioned about, how important it is for the liquidity infusion as such. And, how in terms of the government of India has gone for short-term announcements and all with reform orientation. And much of it has been, of firefighting exercise, emergency firefighting exercise. And I think, you have also emphasized about the economic pandemic package, where interest rates were waived in many matters and in many countries. In fact, you've spoken about that also. And how I think due to what's happened, that in the current pandemic, you spoke about how domestic violence against women has increased, leading to mental health issues, where it's impacted on the care economy. And then the government tried to intervene through cash transfers, and support for employment. And then I think also that the government is employer, the last resort for employment and all. And then I think, maybe it'll be important, in terms of, you spoke about the participation income and basic income. So I think maybe if you could just throw some more light on in terms of, government taking this position about, infusing more on the participation income than basic income. And, also, Dr. Lekha, in terms of what we have also seen is that during the pandemic, the government also, apart from the macroeconomic policy shifts and all, it also tried to bring in changes in certain labor laws and all, So in a way, I think while the economic thrust was, or impetus was brought in, in fact, the labor security or labor income security, I think was given a, short shrift, where I think major laws were, made into codes and all. And so I think labor regulations were diluted. So in a way, in terms of, because I think you do bring in this thing about economic growth and also, employment. So while the government has tried to revive economic growth, and you mentioned about, this reviving economic growth plus, which also talks about the humanitarian concern as such, which I think is the right approach. And, you do also mention about, I think the various measures in terms of fiscal, liquidity trap, and then I think you do talk about how we have this innovative financing that takes place through 3 modes, which is by printing money, which leads to inflationary tendencies, through bond financing, there are risks of that, and through external sources, and that leads to balance of payment issues as such, And of course, you did talk about multilateral financing, which has its own risks and all. So, and then of course, I think towards the end, you do talk about also, that how, due to the present pandemic, government has been coming out with various stimuluses and all. So what the next stimulus package is going to be, in terms of addressing the public health crisis, addressing education, where the enrollment rates have gone down, and which I think if we are not able to check, I think that would take us to a level which was before 1980s. And I think you bring in a very important dimension about the digital divide, which we all have been noticing, that there's a whole chunk in the country, which is suffering due to digital divide, and online education and all is not reaching, or maybe it's reaching just 30%, and that too, where the, with signal issues and all those things as well, And I think you do highlight something very important where I think in this attempt for economic revival, where you talk about, innovative strategies to, have revenue generation, government also needs to take care of the jobs, because the jobs are, there's a lack of jobs, incomes are going down. And, so how is it? And then, of course, you bring about, in terms of gender perspective, that how the unpaid care work, has been increasing for women, how the, the time use survey through gender lens shows as to how the women's burden has increased during the pandemic. And this has happened in India plus the world as well. So, and of course, you talk about also, how, we need to also have this, the GDP, the public health GDP ratio, which is 1%, I think has to be also enhanced and increased. Similar thing is also about education, that we need to have more budgets for education as well. So I think somewhere I do see that you also talk about as to how there has to be convergence of policies from, where both the public health crisis and the public health experts and the economists and the sociologists and the social workers and all these people need to come together to address this issue. So macroeconomics doesn't mean that it's got only to deal with economics, but there's also a lot of, other sectors which need to come in, and the realities need to also, because the realities impact various sectors. So thanks you for this very interesting presentation. You try to make the discussion very, very approachable for many people. You brought in, like many of us are students of economics. So we do get some of the, stuff that you use, but still, I think, you made it very, very, understandable to the public, and thank you for the effort. Arjun and other friends who would want to comment on this, want to ask certain questions, it's open to you to please come in now. Huh?
Yes,
thank you.
Yes. Sir, I think we have Professor Govind Kelkar.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, would you like to?
I have few minutes, so
Yes, ma'am, your video. Yes, is on.
so okay.
Yes, please.
All right. Thank you, Professor Lekha Chakraborty. I really enjoyed so much your discussion, very articulate, highly kind of explanatory, various things. But I agree with most of the things that you have said, particularly with regard to, I took notes on that, particularly with regard to the government trying to create the stimulus, and probably you think that there would be something, at least cash transfer is given to women's empowerment. I also think that probably government concerns for in terms of uh, coming out of this kind of either health crisis. It is certainly a dual crisis. So the health and macroeconomic crisis, which you have very well defined. I had following concerns from a political economist point of view, that participatory economy is fine, but so long it gets a right to workers, to the participants. If workers don't have the right to the kind of factors and means of production, then that this becomes the situation like in India. I mean, women are farmers. I work on the land rights, and I see women are farmers. They are producers. They are producing a lot, but they don't have any right, and the result is the government schemes don't reach them. And if we are going to do the same thing in the participatory economy or participation economy, then probably it would be the kind of, we will be continuing or reproducing and reinforcing the system that had existed, that women's concentration in the informal sector and men's kind of participation in the formal sector, and then all, and the wage disparities and concentration of low paid jobs. These are the things that would really and that explains also why women are hit harder. One reason for that, hit harder in the pandemic. So that I wanted for you to consider and probably say something. My second point was also, I see women, really a large number of rural women, where which is our basic population, a capability crisis. I mean, we are introducing digital economy, but in this digital, I don't see so much kind of knowledge or a refresher course being introduced. The result is that, of course, middle class is aspiring nationally and international, not nationally, but internationally, in terms of dealing with the kind of information technology. But what is being done with regard to the rural women who barely kind of have some access to the uh, video to the phones, mobile phones, and how many would have smartphones and how would they operate a smartphone? So that is the kind of I call this as a capability crisis for women, and the government's attention is needed for this when we are introducing a digital economy. My third concern is also, I have another kind of my own lecture at 5 o'clock, so I'm just rushing kind of thing, that in this industrial policy is recovering. That's true. But what about the tiny industries and SMEs? They are suffering. I mean, they lost, the one thing was they went down kind of a demonetization and then the GST, and that they seem to be disappearing, and there is hardly any kind of. So you talked about the financial oligarchy, which is being created, but who's creating this financial oligarchy? So state's role is very much there, or overlooking the fact and supporting the kind of thing in the name of the recovery. Recovery should not really lead us to pauperization of the masses. That is important. Why there is increasing inequality, why women are worst hit in this kind of thing. That bothers us in terms of the political economy of the gender question. Fiscal rules are important. Fiscal consolidation is important. I agree with you. But what about the public health crisis and enrollment in education and increasing digital divide? I mean, I don't see much attention to this. Probably you are rightly pointed out. I agree with you at that point. that they are likely to do something. But so far, why this was not given a priority? That is important. So I think that I will sum up this in terms of it is really the new kind of paradigm economy is needed. Paradigm shift in terms of how the economy has been addressed and it is being done. My last point was about the violence against women. Violence against women is not really a non-economic issue or a social issue. You'll agree with me. It is a very much an economic issue unless we have these 50% workers actively involved on par with other workers. I think it will be our economy would remain where it is. Why we are lagging so much nationally and internationally? Care work is one thing which is very important, which really doesn't allow women, and it has increased so much now in pandemic. And also they are considered not very well kind workers, in that not very efficient workers, not very skillful workers, and that's why they are beaten up at home and in public sexual harassment in the workplaces. I have been looking at the garment industry. I was surprised to see how much violence is there in supervision, violence of women in supervision, the supervisory roles which men have. So I think something needs to be done in terms of changing our social norms. That is very, very important. In terms of a new lens is needed to address a kind of new economic culture with the kind of inputs of the human rights based culture that would be needed. And thank you. But you have covered most of this thing. I was just giving these as a matter of footnote. Thank you so much, Professor Lekha Chakraborty.
Yeah.
Simi,
Arjun?
like to go? Simi?
Yes, Simi, Arjun, you can have your points, and then we can have Dr. Lekha come in. And then do read some points from the chat also, Arjun.
Yes, yes. Simi, are you coming? I think some issues there.
Yes. I'm sorry. There was some issues.
Yeah, Simi, go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Lekha Chakraborty, Professor Govind Kelkar, and Dr. Indu. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Ma'am, my question to you is more about how we are utilizing or harnessing our policies, monetary and fiscal policies, towards ensuring that no person is left behind in the sustainable development goal era. Because as we see that we are still struggling with ensuring the basic bare minimum necessities for our female folks in terms of health, education, employment, old age pensions, etc. So what are the policy implications for this, and how does the policy respond to this? Your views on this, ma'am. I would just end here because we have other experts as well. Thank you so much. Over to you, Indu, sir.
Yeah. Arjun?
Yes, so Tanya, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Just a second.
Also introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya, and I am doing Masters in Economics from Ashoka University, and I'm a researcher at IMPRI also. Professor, I would like to thank you for this really informative presentation. And Professor, you mentioned TUS survey. We also conducted a TUS survey TUS time use survey for around 5,000 rural women with IMPRI. There we assessed what is happening with rural women. And Professor, what do you think, like how monetary policy can be targeted to help these rural women? Also in terms of fiscal policy, according to GenDev Yojana, 500 rupees have been deposited in their accounts. So how do you think this has affected the rural women? And do you think this policy will be continued further in future rounds as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Professor Utpal De from Shillong, would you? So please try to be brief. Dr. Lekha, is it all right? We'll just collect and then have, we'll come back to you.
This is absolutely awesome. Continue. Yes.
Okay, please. Yes, Professor Day.
Good evening, Dr. Chakraborty. So, I'm sorry I could not join in time, but only looking at your topic, just I have some queries I am here putting. The previous Tania also said, and Madam Govindji also told here that there is a glass ceiling, that women are mostly in the informal and the low paid occupations in general, not all, and men are in the formal occupations, you can see. But when this pandemic started, and so you have seen that informal sectors were mostly affected. So it's 1,000 times it is repeated. So needless to say, that means automatically it comes down like this, that women are more affected. So when we look at the northeastern part of this country, here you will see, apart from the household work, even in the market selling of the fishes and in the footpaths, informal, small petty businesses, in the tourist sites, the small food stalls, not that big hotels and others, so which are owned by the big people or Marwaris and managers, etc., are all male. But women who were highly benefited by the tourism on the on-sites, they worked. But because of this pandemic, so all of their activities gone. Still now, no tourists are coming. And even if market little opened, but that is mainly formal sector, footpaths, etc., very less. A large number of women were involved in such activities, so for selling their homegrown products and other. So these are the things, how these policies will help them. These policies I do not see that helping, accepting that 500 rupees giving in their account, as Tania told here. But that also I see that 500 is given, but nowadays price gone 3 times, 4 times for every product, whatever they need. So giving 500, next day 500 taken out from their pocket. So because that day also I told, where potato, onion, all this maybe 30, 20, 30 rupees. Now it is 60 rupees, 80 rupees, 100 also onion in some places I saw in Shillong. So that means you are giving 500, maybe it is not going back to government, only business people are getting back. But that same 500 is going out of the pocket. So in reality, how these women who are running their own family, and many are there, single women families are there. So how they can manage? That is one thing. And second thing is that about this inflationary situations, that when in the middle of the pandemic, we said that both demand is affected because no money in the pocket of the people, in the hands of the people, and supply also choked because of the lockdown, production stopped, business stopped, transport stopped, all these. So both sides. And so monetary policy were to inject the liquidity so that it can improve to some extent the production activities, as well as giving some free money in the accounts, people's demand capability will rise. But we did not see that. The demand has increased because, as I said here, that real income has not gone up, and whatever free rations they get, that is locally in some places maybe benefiting to some families in reality actually. So why this inflation then? How it can be connected with the because if there is no much of increase in demand in the market, how this only because of the disruption in the market linkage, transportation. The transportation now improved, but we see the prices are going up, and even recent CMI and other reports are telling too much. That if your 7.58 they are telling, but food inflation more than 10 and 11. So in recent months, so how people will survive? And if further interest again starts rising, as you have seen, again fuel price started increasing, so all this will become a hodgepodge situation. This existing monetary policies to inject liquidity, reduce the interest, so it will bounce back again. So how will they tackle all these things? So, and what is it you think what will be the future, and how next when the RBI will sit, what can they do in this respect?
Thank you.
Okay.
Professor Day. GB Ati is joining us from Kanyakumari. GB. GB, can you hear us? Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was actually a good, informative session. So I was also working with IMPRI in our previous study, where we try to understand how the pandemic had affected the rural women in India. So one of the questions that I had was about, are there gaps in gender, in terms of gender, in the policy makers leadership in the financial institutions, in terms of like the monetary and fiscal institutions. So there was like one other point that I wanted to ask. It was about, so during our study, one of our finding was about there was a lot of monetary benefits which was given by the government, but especially in terms of the Jandan account, there were a lot of women who lost access to that particular account because they hadn't maintained it active during, like, before the pandemic. So they didn't actually get benefited from the cash transfers. So, like how do we tell that this monetary benefits are actually reaching them? You had made a point about this. It'll be good to hear your opinion about this as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Ritika, go on. We have Ritika Gupta also from Delhi, also economics. Yes, please.
Good evening. Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation. My question to you is, you mentioned gendered digital divide in your remarks. We usually see this divide among the lower class in urban and rural areas, or among poor and rich. But in middle class income groups also, a male child is preferred to given a digital device than a female child. So what fiscal or monetary measure which can be devised to the public regarding where girls can easily access these devices, or they can easily buy these devices, so that they do not get refrain from their studies or jobs? So this is my question.
I think Arjun, we can have Dr. Lekha respond, and then we'll have another set of questions,
Yes.
Thank you, Ritika.
I think so,
So,
yes. Too many
yeah.
questions. Yes.
Yeah, so I think first let her respond, then we'll have a second round of questions. Dr. Lekha, please, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Indu Prakash. From your discussion, I understood that how much you enjoyed my lecture, and thanks for giving me that confidence. I really enjoyed the way you have, assimilated and articulated the points I mentioned, and thank you so much for that. And 2 points particularly I enjoyed that you highlighted, which was very subtle in my presentation. One was that debate of participation income versus basic income, and other, you rightly highlighted the importance of the heterogeneity of stakeholders. It is not just economists, it is economists plus civil society organizations, plus parliamentarians and the policymakers. We all have to work together to take it to an outcome level. So I particularly enjoyed that point. And in this participation versus basic income debate, this concern of yours was also highlighted by Professor Govind Kalkar. I could understand that it was there in SEMI. Tanya also came up with that, and Utpalda, of course, with the evidences from the northeastern region, has highlighted. And using that gender, the kind of concern of cost versus access to credit, that was another point. Everything, it was closely related to what you have discussed in the beginning. So let us take one by one, but I don't have any definite answers for this. But if you ask a heterodox economist what is a solution, then they come up with the first the priority as employment policy. their priority, that employment policy is everything. Like when the government comes and acts as an employer of last resort, just like the way monetary policy acting as the lender of last resort, that's a kind of policy which heterodox economists always highlight as a solution. So I do believe that the participation income, people have to participate in the economic activity and earn an income. So that's what I do believe, because universal basic income in the times of pandemic, when there is no arena for a strong economic activity for a short period of time, universal basic income or cash transfers to the households can work. But I do believe that participation income is quite important. Then the question, rightly pointed out by Professor Govind Kelkar, we floated employer of last resort policy in our country as a labor rights, or it is for poverty alleviation. So this is an important question, because I think this NREGA, the employment, that guarantee scheme, the job guarantee scheme, is both a labor rights as well as to alleviate poverty, to give income transfers by involving people in the economic activity. So I do accept that it has to be from the labor rights perspective also. Otherwise, when you apply a gentle lens, though by the policy design that 40% or around that should be women beneficiaries, but when you get the data, the real data from across different states of India, we don't see that even 40% of that particular program get accessed by women beneficiaries. And there are a lot of restraints or a lot of problems for women to come and access, because even when government acted as an employer of last resort, the time poverty prevented the women from accessing that employment policy, because the time poverty is due to the dual work burden of the women in the care economy sector. And this time poverty affects the income poverty of a woman. So unless we tackle with the time poverty using the deficiency of infrastructure, if a rural if a village has no water, if ensuring clean water is the prime responsibility of a woman, that's a time poverty. If ensuring clean fuel for the household is a responsibility of women and girl children, that's a kind of concern. So government acted as in the pandemic package, they really came up with two important policy announcements. But given the magnitude of the crisis in our country, whether that is enough, this is a question asked to me by that little girl, the economist from Kanyakumari, and the Ritika from New Delhi, and Tanya, who worked with IMPRI. So their concerns were, is this enough? What we have announced as a cash transfer, which is just 500, and also Uppalda giving clear empirical evidences of price spiraling, and also the loss of employment opportunities, and because of the loss of many sectors in the economy, including the tourism and other important infrastructure sectors, then can this cash transfers announced by the government is enough? The magnitude, this is a real concern. I hope that it has to be scaled up. I do agree to that. And second question clearly came up from all the respondents, was that the debate between the cost of credit and access to the credit. For women, cost of credit matters, or access to credit, because Tanya, I think she clearly mentioned that there are accounts, or the economist from Kanyakumari, she clearly mentioned the opening the bank account was only a prerequisite, but maintaining it away from the zero balance and to access the amount, the cash transfers given by the government of India. So all these requires that continuity. So whether women could be able to access it, that access was another important concern raised, and this is an implementation issue, and the local level functionaries and the banking zones need to look into this issue, because before we floated the access to the credit for women through the digital infrastructure and through the GenDev, what is happening in our country, there was a peer monitoring model through the formation of self-help groups, and the money was collected in the self-help groups, and the self-help group opened an account with the bank and it was deposited. So the savings was channelized. So there, I was wondering whether women, they are not defaulters of credit at all. Even then, whether they were, considered as bankable clients. The access to the formal financial system was a concern, and the cost of credit at that time also, from the various survey, we came to we found that even with the money lenders in the village, at high rate of interest, women were doing Ponzi finance. So in that case, access to the formal banking system, that decision was, a good decision. But at the implementation level, as the participant has rightly pointed out, whether the women are able to access it properly, that's a concern. And second is whether the quantity, the magnitude of the announcement of cash transfers in the times of pandemic for women, whether we need to scale it up. Of course, we need to scale it up. And I do completely agree to these two concerns. So taking away the discussion from participation income versus a basic income, from the cost of credit versus access to credit debates, let's get into the capability crisis highlighted by Professor Govind Kelkar. Of course, it's a capability crisis when it comes to, accessing education through a digital infrastructure, to a digital platform, and especially the rural, young women and children accessing the education, that relates to the capability crisis. And we need to have an economic firefighting package to tackle this digital divide. And so far, the government of India and the state governments have not yet come up with adequate, policy packages or announcements to deal with this crisis. And this needs to be done, otherwise it will affect the effective enrollment ratio. Because we have seen in the 2020 Human Development Report, this issue was quite highlighted. Like if you look at the three dimensions of the human development, like education, health, and income, in order to prevent the indicators worsening to the pre-80s or pre-70s levels, we need to have adequate fiscal and monetary policies to prevent that. That's quite agreed. Now comes the question that the announcements should not be just get confined to state business relations, and it should not be just for the elite capture. It has to trickle down to prevent the inequality from widening. Professor Govind Kelkar's point, that point is well taken, that what is the role of state in times of pandemic? It is not only the law and order, it has to be also come from a capability deprivation framework by adequately addressing the social infrastructure, especially in health and education. And that point is very well taken. Otherwise, the economic revival, what we are experiencing right now, will not be sustained unless we have proper packages to develop human capability and to address the humanitarian crisis. And that point, that political economy of gender equality, which she was highlighting, is well taken. And violence against women, of course, it's getting accelerated in the times of pandemic. It is an economic issue. I do agree to that. And we have a study conducted by Natadori and Rekhu from the University of Dublin, and they quantified the impact of the violence against women on macroeconomy, and they arrived at a conclusion that it is around 1% of GDP, and it's quite a concern. So we have macroeconomic papers related to violence against women and how it is affecting the economic growth. So violence against women is an economic issue. I do agree to that. And the next question is by Simi Mehta on LNOB, leave nobody behind. I do agree, because the fiscal and monetary policy should not be just on the framework of economic growth. It has to be, as she rightly highlighted, and it was also clear from Professor Indu Prakash's presentation, that it has to be based on leave nobody behind framework. Because if you just get skewed to the economic growth, the growth itself will not be translated into the human development concerns or the humanitarian concerns. And we need to have proper fiscal and monetary policies which focuses on the humanitarian concerns. In that way, what Tanya has asked me, whether the fiscal policy or the monetary policy have that flexibility to do it, because you can understand that the macroeconomic framework itself is so constrained. It is based on certain rules. On the fiscal policy side, we have fiscal consolidation and fiscal rules. On the monetary policy side, we have inflation targeting, which looks into only the price stability. So when there is a transition in the macro policy making from discretion of a policymaker to the rules-based, identifying the humanitarian concerns and to address the gender concerns, we need to have specific policy tools because the macroeconomic framework per se is constrained. So that's why the importance of policy tools like gender budgeting is very important policy tool in times of pandemic. So all these addresses you guys have highlighted here. I think in the coming up February budget, when we look at the gender budgeting statement, I hope that there will be a scale up of allocations addressing the concerns of education in terms of digital divide, addressing the concerns of health, because the frontline warriors are mostly women, addressing the concerns livelihood crisis, and also the violence against women, the safety and the security of women, and the capability crisis. So all these articulation, I hope that in the upcoming budget, if not a stimulus package before the budget announcement, at least in the gender budget statement, I hope that we will have more allocations for that. But one important question we looked into in the pandemic package through a gender lens for the UN Women is, whatever we announced as policy packages, are they translating it into outcomes, or are they translating into actual expenditure? This is a fiscal marksmanship question. Fiscal marksmanship is, if you don't deviate from what you promised or what you announced in budget and what is the actual spending, then your marksmanship is perfect. But whenever you look at the fiscal variables, you see that the budget estimates what is announced in the budget and the actual spending, that there is a huge deviation. If that happens, what's the outcome we talk about? Because this marksmanship needs to be perfect. And that is the first concern. Whatever we announced, if we announce high spending, that per se does not ensure high actual expenditure. So this flow of funds, and there should not be any deviation, there should not be any leakage. And this fiscal marksmanship is an important concern. And I hope that, Tanya has asked me, or the girl from Abhi from Kanyakumari asked me about the gaps in governance, the gaps in, more women on board in fiscal and monetary policy realms. Of course, that's a concern, but that is based on the assumption that if there are more women on board, then the public expenditure decisions or the monetary policy decisions will be favoring women. But of course, the personal characteristics of a leader, whether the central bank governor or whether it's a finance minister or prime minister, the personal characteristics matters a lot for incorporating the simple things. They are the most sophisticated things. That putting gender lens and addressing the gender concerns is an important issue. But so far, if you look at the central banks, not even a single central bank has talked about the gender lens. But there is a good beginning in terms of ECB. Christian Lagarde has come up with an argument that climate change should be the part of monetary policy function. So climate change, and so far we never thought that climate change can be the part of a monetary policy reaction function. So like that, if you think if climate change can be on board, then the gender-aware human development concerns should be equally on board. And I hope that the central bank governors will start speaking about the impact of their policies on gender, or the policies they frame in terms of credit or in terms of the price stability. These have gender differential impacts. And in our country, as somebody rightly pointed out, Utpalda has rightly pointed out that it is not only center, but states are also equally on board as partners. And also Professor Govind Kelkar pointed out this issue, the role of subnational governments in recovery. Economic recovery is, or macroeconomic stabilization is not just a function of center government, it also a concern of state governments. But here also the, the revenue certainty matters, and intergovernmental fiscal transfer is an important source of revenue for the subnational governments. And we are waiting for 15th Finance Commission's report to be made public. I think it will be tabled in the parliament, not in the winter session. Winter session we may not have because of the pandemic. I mean, COVID, situation is getting worsened, but I hope that it will be tabled in the parliament in the budget session. And, I expect there will be a COVID grant or COVID-related intergovernmental fiscal transfers will be there. But how far a gentle lens is applied by the 15th Finance Commission, we have to wait and see. In their interim report, in order to address the population crisis, they have incorporated TFR, total fertility rate, because if that variable is not created in vacuum, it is quite a gender-aware variable. So in a derived manner, a gender concern is addressed in the tax transfer formula of the 15th Finance Commission, but we need to wait and see whether unconditional grants through the tax formula or conditional specific purpose transfers were designed in terms of COVID pandemic, addressing the COVID pandemic at the local level, or whether a gentle lens is properly applied in the intergovernmental fiscal transfer mechanism. We need to wait and see. I stop here, and I hope that I have taken up all your concerns. And if I didn't, then you can highlight to me, and I will revisit the questions. I have written up all the questions you have asked, and I thought Professor Indu Prakash can help me. Over to you.
Yeah. No, I think, you have answered most of the questions beautifully. There were a couple of points which I'll just say, and then maybe there are some questions also in question and answers section. I'll take up that also. One thing I also want to bring in here, I think, first of all, your presentation and your answering the questions, I think you've done a great job. No dispute on that at all. I was also wondering, and maybe you can just throw some light on that for many of us, we also found, that all the things that spoke about the macroeconomic policies and macro interventions that took place, somewhere during this pandemic, I think maybe it's also a lesson for a government to have a kind of a, economic stimulus preparedness, like we have like disaster preparedness. So, if a crisis like that happens, we need to be economically prepared as well. So like somehow we felt that our government was at loss, that it was more reacting than acting, and, through the work that we did in Delhi and other places, our friends did through civil society organizations, we felt that, like it was more, I think the approach at times was pretty ad hoc, that a large number of civil society organizations had to come in, and apart from just distributing food grains and rations and all those things, during this emergency relief, I think what was also important was that we realized that the liquidity crunch was important. People didn't have money to, get gas cylinders, to get gas. How would they cook the rations that they got? So I think, so the liquidity issue was a major issue. And I think also, and then, of course, there are certain issues as such that you mentioned. I'm perfectly in agreement with that. There have been some questions raised by a few friends, Lekha ji. So I'll just read that out so that you can also take that in your response, next response. There's one question by Tejasvi Yadav. What are the reasons why women are biased against access to credit? Then there are some questions by another friend. It's a range of questions. I'll just read that out. Why is economic revival being done at the expense of the health of the people? Who will take the jobs if they are not well or even dead? Yes, labor laws, the draft is there. Women are sure to be exploited with the 12-hour working hour rules. What are your views? Can we have such a policy which takes care of female health, education, and employment along with an assured old age security? It's there in bits and pieces.
still women continue to be in a lack. It's starting to see we are still struggling to ensure bare minimum. And I think the final point which I also want to mention here is that, like from the revenue and expenditure model, we also see that if the government doesn't spend money on, say, empowering people financially, then I think even the revenue is not going to be, there. So I think revenue and expenditure needs to be seen as a twin process, that the money infusion, as you mentioned about the financial infusion, is very important. And we also saw how maybe many of the state governments did not get resources from the central government to deal with COVID or even with the rations that they were supplying. So the financial stimulus for COVID, dealing with COVID, was missing in many places, So I think, so I think, and then of course you mentioned about the intergovernmental fiscal transfer. So maybe I think, if you have an idea in terms of what were the rounds of physical or financial infusion that took place, which actually buttressed the economy, and helped it from falling and kept the rise, kept it rising, though we might be -3 or whatever in GDP. But somehow I think if we are able to just talk on these, I think it will be also important, And Arjun and Simi, if you want to add something more to it.
Yes. Sir, your video is also getting stuck. Yeah, please check.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. We also have Professor Girija Upadhyay, ma'am. If you want to ask anything, you are.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. But yes, very less of your voice is coming. Okay.
Ma'am, if you could be a bit louder.
Yes, ma'am. You can also on your video.
Turn on your video.
No, I have some issue there.
No issue. No problem.
Yeah. So can I? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Please go on.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. There is a very succinctly all the issues have been outlined. I just have one comment to make. Excuse me, I have just one comment to make, that in times of a pandemic or a crisis, this is an extraordinary situation. We need to distinguish between what I would say taking care of an extreme contingency, and on the other hand, looking at very fundamental structural issues. At this time, to mix up both the humanitarian requirements and a stimulus for growth is like, just managing a sailing boat caught in a sudden storm, and at the same time trying to chart a course to reach the promised land. So I think we should distinguish, and very rightly Dr. Chakraborty has pointed out, for example, our whole anathema of deficit financing. Yes, at this time, we can't stand on those old normative judgments, whether it is good or bad, and it is a contingent requirement, and we have to do it. So the other observation is that in times of a crisis, always the weakest chain in the link is going to be hit the hardest. In fact, there was another issue where it was about hunger. Naturally, the poor and the hungry are going to be hit worse than, and similarly, in the gender inequality, we are probably, but here I'm a little confused because I found, in an anecdotal sense, not in terms of a statistically based study, that it was these women who were doing, say, domestic jobs who were running a family, because men had usual vacations. They may be tempo drivers, they may be laborers. Yeah, so I don't know really how much it changed during breadwinners in such a time. And there's the other issue of, there are so many issues. Sorry to come in late. I had to leave for a little while. But I'd just like to make the point that the mobile payments really stepped in, kicked in when you couldn't go to the bank to withdraw your money and you needed the cash to pay your vegetable vendor. So this was an interesting thing that all of them were immediate. I mean, they were already on mobile payment systems. So it, in a way, it was a kind of a seamless transition for those who did mobile payments into continuing with transacting with their basic needs. So I just summarize that I think there is a very vast difference between a contingency management strategy, economic macroeconomic policy strategy, and one which is addressing the structural issues, and that is why we should, at this point, let us focus first on the contingency. Let us come out of the pandemic at this point in time, that the whole economic machinery has come to a grinding halt. It's functioning in bits and pieces. Is it an appropriate real time to talk about how to increase jobs? What were we doing before the pandemic? We hadn't really got answers to these questions of the capital employment ratios, what was happening, what was the technological shift that was not producing the kind of jobs. With capital investment, why wasn't there more capital investment? So these are different issues. Right now, I think we should have humanitarianism at the core of all interventions. And once you're out of the pandemic, I think then we come back to basics. It was a very, very illuminative lecture by Dr. Chakraborty and all the panelists. Some I missed. And this is what I would have to say. Thank you, Dr. Arjun.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, we have Sunidhi. Sunidhi is joining from Jamshedpur. Sunidhi, please unmute.
Hello, I'm Sunidhi, and I'm a researcher at IMPRI, and I'm joining from Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. So a lot of the programs has already been provided in the rural areas, but in urban areas also we require programs such as NREGA, where money is the key concern. So coming to the fiscal part, I want to ask, what kind of fiscal measures do you think is required with respect to urban areas, especially for women? Should there be more self-help groups or NREGA sort of scheme? What should be done in urban sector, because the female participation rate is really low and most of the women tends to get into self-employed jobs because they want flexibility. So how this can be structured during the time of this pandemic? Then coming to the monetary side, I want to ask, why repo rate and not bank rate and other tools are used more while framing monetary policy? And what do you think should be done from monetary policy side to mend gender gaps?
Yes. Thank you, Sunidhi.
I think we can now have, Dr. Lekha to come in now.
Yes. Yes. Indu sir, let me add few points.
Please.
Question, yes. Then we can go to.
Go ahead.
Will that be right, Lekha ma'am?
Of course.
Yeah. Yes. Also conclude for timing. Yes. So let me first congratulate Dr. Chakraborty for joining on a short notice, not being able to. But ma'am writes so well, so that ma'am appears in so many newspaper, and her views are also one of the leading voices as an economist in our country. Ma'am has really highlighted very important point that the second and third wave is coming, and what in terms of economic thoughts and discussion going on, not only in India, but across the world. Ma'am has really given the example of economic recovery as we are seeing it, U curve, V curve. Professor Arun Kumar gave a lecture at our platform last month. He mentioned something called K recovery, which is also some of the sectors going up like IT and others, but some of the sectors really going down, really like a K recovery. But since the second, third wave is coming, the fiscal push, or in terms of thought process also, be it how much of public debt one can have, and rightly also Professor Upadhyay was also mentioning that this will be required. So ma'am highlighted the point on instantaneous firefighting and also the long-term plans where we are doing. In these terms, since we require this fiscal help and that push, I really wanted to ask that now our government also is focusing more that now we have to push, but really the expenditure side is going more towards again to infrastructure side. What do you see of this one? We also have something called National Infrastructure Pipeline of more than 1 lakh crore, so many projects there. And the renewed push is also toward infrastructure. Do you think during this pandemic time, this will mend the gender gap, or that is the right way to go through, since we will also have, deficit and other things? And in terms of the nudging and which RBI is doing for banks to, reverse repo rate, the point, ma'am, you raised, ma'am, what do you think should be done, especially to help women in both urban and rural scenarios, so that, as you have rightly pointed out, the access to credit, that remains a big issue. We have Mudra and other schemes, but really not very much translating into empowering women to get into our market scenario. And ma'am, you mentioned the 3 point also Indu sir highlighted, that printing the money, bond financing, and then ma'am, external help. As Professor Arun Kumar also suggested that we should have something, and Professor Arun Kumar's estimates are also very, very pessimistic. He suggested that we should have something called COVID bonds to finance our requirements. Ma'am, what do you think should be the way? Do you recommend or see that there are more pros and cons in doing which one of them? Will the printing the money would be a suitable thing going ahead? Because RBI and government, we see that both these are also adrift most of the time, especially during the last few years. So how do we see, having said so, really, because of the pandemic, there has also been the sectoral change from the monetary side, because different sectors have different mechanisms also. Do you also see now the time is coming when subnational monetary policy sort of things would also be, required? Because you really mentioned climate change. So if those things are also getting integrated, then do monetary policy would have more role? Or I would say also, if we have this digital currency and those things coming, then very less role. How do you see this, the new digital age changing this dynamics, and also access to this form of new finance or capital or the digital world, and their accessibility, especially from the point of the gender gap we have? During our studies, ma'am, we also highlighted many of the field study, telephonic study also we have done during the pandemic, and talked to a lot of people. What in our view, we also suggested earlier that $1 a day and an Android phone was really required. $1 a day, typically 2,000 rupees per person. As you know, so some basic, we also taken into the account the thalinomics and other things. And Android phone really, which is required. Do you think those are the essential things which should be pushed? And ma'am, you really highlighted the budget, next budget which is coming. What are the things which you would suggest for the budget, or it should entail for mending also the gender gap, but also, prioritizing in terms of health, or what is needed to fight this pandemic? We really have a very good foreign exchange and macroeconomic scenario. How should we harness it and make a woman the mainstream towards this recovery? Ma'am, I will stop here. 15th Finance Commission also, I was just mentioning that, what do you see its role for, gender budgeting or finance, you being the expert, and what are those things, if you can also enlighten us? I will stop here in this, sir, if you want to add anything.
Sure. No, nothing. Let's have Lekha ji coming up. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so brilliant. And thank you, Tejasri. Professor Indu Prakash sir also asked about the labor reform. So let me begin with that. Then, I will go, taking each question, just like the way I have written it down. Okay. So Tejasri also has highlighted the importance of the structural reforms. I actually missed to react to that when Professor Indu Prakash asked me about the labor reforms. Of course, pandemic, that's a crisis, but there are opportunities in crisis. we have to, find a space for floating the medium term and the structural reforms. That's all fine. But the ordinance route of, coming up with the labor codes changing, whether that was a right, a kind of a decision or not, I don't know, just because the labor reforms needs to happen from a very consultative tripartite agreement between the state management and the laborers. So whether that kind of a tripartite agreement or consultations happened before we altered or amended the labor codes and come up with the labor reforms, that consultative process was completely absent or partially present. This is a huge concern, and I hope that it's not final and it's only evolving. And that's a problem of having the structural reforms when we try to do in the times of pandemic. So that's really a concern, whether that labor reforms has clearly translated into the intended outcome which we wanted it to happen. And here Professor Girija Upadhyay's point is quite well taken, whether we should go for the addressing the structural concerns, or as it's a extraordinary times, it has to be the macroeconomic policy making need to be floated on the contingent requirement. And that urgency, the contingency strategy is what is more relevant. And I cannot agree with you more that the importance of the firefighting, that it's an extreme crisis, and humanitarianism, that has to be the basis of an economic policy reform at this moment of all the policy packages. And that point is very well taken, and she has clearly come up with a very detailed analysis. And there only one thing I would like to add to Professor Girija Upadhyay's point is, of course, if we take a decision sequentially by addressing lives first and livelihood next, then of course the people may die, more people may die out of hunger than from the COVID pandemic. Your concern is well taken. That's why the importance of having a simultaneous policy decision of addressing the life versus livelihood, that analytical framework is quite relevant, rather than sequentially addressing of life and then after addressing to that concern, then when we take up the livelihood crisis. No, it has to be simultaneous. And I cannot agree with you more on that point. And of course, the weakest chain in the link, that gets affected more. So we cannot even say that this is a macroeconomic crisis. We will deal with this first and then get into the gender concerns. No, because if there is a macroeconomic crisis, it is going to affect women the most. So appropriately, appropriate policy at this moment is quite crucial, rather than, waiting to say that once the crisis is over, then we will deal with that. And of course, even the structural things, if I focus a minute, there is a debate that in our country, especially in the context of emerging economies, whether, as Professor Girija Upadhyay was pointing out, whether the business cycles, you address your policy as a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And here comes a question that if there is no clear business cycles in the context of an emerging economy, then monetary policy or fiscal policy acting as a counter-cyclical fiscal policy has got its own limitations. And in this context, the monetary policy has got, more limitations than a fiscal policy. So the fiscal dominance, I approve that point, that there should be a fiscal dominance, and the fiscal policy stance need to be, taking the things ahead, which the monetary policy cannot deal completely, because whatever it takes to, address the pandemic, that was the a crucial point in which Dr. Shaktikant Das has announced the pandemic package. But if there are gaps, then the fiscal policy makers needs to come in, and that point is well taken. And then comes the question of revenue.
Lost your voice somehow.
Hello, am I audible?
Now, yes, please go on.
Am I audible? It's clear?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The next, the point I mentioned, I was not off air for a long time, right?
Yes, right.
Okay, let me go ahead.
Yes.
Okay, next question is about the revenue expenditure. Of course, in the times of pandemic, we cannot consider revenue expenditure as bad. This is quite highlighted by Dr. Arjun also, like when we take an accelerated move towards reviving the capital spending by less, are we less focusing on the revenue expenditure? No, this is a context, this is a pandemic context in which we cannot assume that revenue expenditure is bad at all, because we need to have more revenue expenditure which has got instantaneous impact in nature, because capital expenditure is a long term, its impact on growth is long term. So we cannot assume that the revenue expenditure is bad in the present context. And as the speaker next to Rajashree, as they rightly highlighted, that the policy coordination, the failure of the policy coordination may be a major, reason for, people not getting access to what all addressed by the government. So addressing the pandemic package is one. The policy coordination is at another. Center state, monetary fiscal. So policy coordination and the policy certainty, I do agree to that point that it should not be a policy coordination failure. And now coming to the question of Jamshedpur, the Suniti from Jamshedpur asked me that the labor force participation of women is coming down, and it's huge concern. Of course, even before pandemic, we have, agreed to the fact that the fastest and smartest way to develop a country is to have female workforce participation up. We have to accelerate the female workforce participation. It's plummeting like anything. So what could be the proper policy tools to address this issue in the urban and rural areas? This is what she has asked me. And here the prime importance should be given to the care economy infrastructure, because what is binding a woman from accessing the market economy is the care economy burden. So unless we have proper infrastructure on board to address these concerns, then the female workforce participation will not go up. So that, the sensitivity is very important to address the concerns related to the female workforce participation rate to come up. Next, as she rightly pointed out, regarding the questions related to the employer of last resort policy. Of course, in the urban areas also, we started floating, the employer of last resort policies. But because of the differentials in the wages, there could be a reverse migration. So there are many issues in which it can be as effective as the rural employment guarantee package. There are concerns, and economists have already highlighted about that. And in this context, if you ask me how you can improve the liquidity of the poor and the needy to address to the essential, I do say that increase the minimum wages. This is the moment in which we can take this decision that we have to have the minimum, the wages needs to be revised at this moment. More than cash transfers, if you focus more on the participation income, it's a very crucial thing that we need to, increase the minimum wages, and that can even infuse the, the demand stimulation. It can infuse liquidity in the system. But, I didn't mention about helicopter money because I'm not an advocate of helicopter money at all. The helicopter money is basically one variant of helicopter money is delivering the cash to the firms and the households. And another mode of helicopter money is infusing, the money financing of the fiscal programs in a way Dr. Arjun has mentioned about the seigniorage financing. So here, I'm not advocating for the helicopter money, but the kind of cash transfers, whether it can stimulate the economy or not, whether helicopter money can, trigger the economy or not, this largely depends on the decision that whether people will spend or save. And if you see the recent high frequency data coming up from RBI, we have seen that the financial savings have gone up. That's a reality. And credit deployment, if you look at, there's a gap and the financial savings have gone up. So the propensity of people to save or to spend depends on that, that's a crucial determinant how the economic stimulus package in the form of cash transfer or the liquidity, what we are providing, whether it will trigger the economy or not. Because that's a very important point, whether people would like to save or people would like to spend. That's quite crucial. And Suniti has also asked me about the traditional monetary policy tools like repo rates and what could be the other policy tools. And if I have a quick look at the pandemic package or outside pandemic package announcements by Dr. Shaktikant Das, what's coming up to my mind is the Operation Twist he has announced. That is, it's like the elongation of the maturity structure of the bond market by a simultaneous buying and selling of bonds. Like simultaneously, you are selling the bonds of the short term in nature and buying the bonds long term in nature. So it's like you're basically having the maturity structure of your bond market towards long term, and that reduces the refinancing risk in the short term. And it's a kind of a strategy by getting more time to act, rather than you are bothered with the refinancing risk. So that's a way, this Operation Twist is what is coming to my mind right now. And the questions related to applying a gender lens in the monetary policies, so far not even a single central bank has come up with an announcement that we are doing this for women. No, not yet. But the potential tools could be the cost of credit. But the thing is that as I mentioned earlier, people were doing Ponzi financing at the high rates of interest, even with the money lenders. So whether the cost of credit alone is crucial for financial empowerment of women, no, the access of credit is equally relevant. Then, as the participants have rightly highlighted, if there are leakages from the IMPRI, the participants from the IMPRI, they have rightly highlighted the leakages in the system when it comes to the access to the credit, that we have created the basic digital infrastructure, but whether that is working fine or not, that's an implementation issue. And that needs to be, we need to correct that. And finally, I take up the questions by, of course, the Ritika has asked me about the digital divide, and it was rightly highlighted by Professor Indu, Prakash and Dr. Arjun, that $1 a day and an Android phone, how nicely Dr. Arjun has put that. That's quite a major announcement, that at least $1 a day and an Android phone. And you have rightly, and you have given, you have said it very nicely, that point. And your Dr. Arjun, your question regarding how we can finance the pandemic package in this period, because it's very important for us to spend, to have a fiscal stimulus, and we need to have a fiscal space on board, whether it has to be through printing money because it's got its own limitations of inflationary expectations, or whether it is through COVID bond. So here, COVID bond, I can imagine about the consoles which was floated in the World War time, that the consoles, it was a long-term bond in the market in which the refinancing was prolonged, and that was the right kind of financing the world war. So a COVID bond is the right thing or not, and I know that economists have been talking about it, but the government of India, how they are going to approach in terms of financing the deficit, we need to wait and see. And so far, I think there is a clear message that it's more than the fiscal austerity, returning to the fiscal austerity or returning to a deficit threshold to 3% of GDP. There are indications from the government of India that they need to deal with the crisis by accepting little level of flexibility to the fiscal rules. And that's a very good decision by the government of India. And how they are going to come up with the revised fiscal rules to address the pandemic, that clear the roadmap, we have to wait and see. And I hope that in the next budget there will be a clear what do you call it, an indication. And Dr. Arjun asked me about the budgetary expectations for the 2021. I do think that we need to focus more on three main things. One is the digital divide. The second is the public health infrastructure crisis, and third is a livelihood crisis. And if these three issues are given more importance, and the announcements we have already heard from the fiscal and the monetary side, if that can be scaled up, given the magnitude of the issue, that could be the beautiful thing that can happen. And that's it. And regarding Dr. Arjun's, that's my final point regarding the monetary policy maker should be given the first mover advantage and the priority, or the fiscal policy maker, in that, what should be it? That more central bank independence, or there should be a fiscal dominance? That's a beautiful question. And so far, we have lived with, giving emphasis to the fiscal policy dominance, and the monetary policy was, we have not yet heard about a central bank independence in that way. Of course, there is no goal independence. That is the, we have the independence of what you call the operational independence by formulating the monetary policy committee, and they're constantly dealing with the issues, with the credit policy and the repo rate announcement. So if you ask me, as I come from the fiscal policy background and know the significance of the fiscal policies, I do believe that the fiscal policy stimulus has got a much more impact on the economy, especially in the times of pandemic, than, the monetary policy. And I do stop here, and I look forward to your winding up. Thanks.
Thank you. Ma'am, that $1 a day and an Android really came from many studies we did, which most of the studies Dr. Indu Prakash Singh coordinated with all the field work through his excellent NGO and all the network all across the India. So that is something we all came up. And Indu sir, ma'am really highlighted two very pertinent points for which Indu sir works a lot on the field. Sir, one was minimum wage, very less economists, talk about. Ma'am is suggesting that that is something we should focus. And the second thing which Indu sir will have to lead us, that RBI is not making, RBI as a central bank, we also had, we also say women Lakshmi, So RBI, the Dhan bank, not doing anything for gender. So there is gender gap at leadership, rightly, as I think GB highlighted. But also the RBI is also, or the central bank is also not having any policy or per se, which ma'am also highlighted that one thing also could be, which is the cost of the capital. For SME, we give, lower the cost of capital, or all these things. Very, I think, I would say this was excellent. Listening again to a very erudite economic professor and, practitioner at our time. Thank you so much, ma'am. Indu sir, over to you. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Lekha, you made both the monetary and the fiscal policy, kind of understandable to every one of us. I think some of us have been students of economics, and some may not be, but I think some of us could understand the words you used. I think because I think there were we also felt the strain, and the pain that you also mentioned. What the government could have done and should be doing. So thanks, for making this particular area understandable to all of us from a very interesting perspective that you brought in, and answering all the questions beautifully. So I think our students also, who are at IMPRI, interns and all, did a great job, and they've asked some very relevant questions coming from the field, both in terms of rural and urban interventions. So thank you, Arjun and Simi, for leading this work in IMPRI, where you got a large number of students involved in this work. So I think it's also been a deeper engagement at various levels to understand what's happening both in urban and rural India as such, both with the city makers and the village makers, that's what, as we call them, the poor people, in fact. And, I think to the question that Arjun had asked you, Dr. Arjun has asked you, in terms of what do you think that the budget should focus on, budget 2021, I think you said that it should address the issue of digital divide, it should address the issue of public health crisis and the livelihood crisis. I think all the points are well taken, and we hope that in the future, talks that we're going to have here, the gender gap talks that we're going to have, I think we'll be dilating more on this. And thank you for taking your time, and thank you for giving large amount of your time for this discussion today. It was not, I must tell you, theoretically and in all ways, it was not an easy conversation, but you made every effort to make it very easy. So I compliment you for talking on something so abstruse, something so, difficult in a very, very understandable language. So thank you for bearing with us. Thank you for answering all the questions immaculately. And I think, Arjun, we can call it a day now.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I think, so thanks from all of us for this fascinating discussion, and we look forward to more engagements with you in future as well. Zindabad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you.